thanks for joining us. My name is Quinn and I'm the lead of Indigenous initiatives at the Gord Downey and Cheney Wenjack Fund. Inspired by Cheney's story and Gord's call to build a better Canada, we aim to build cultural understanding and create a path toward reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. Let's begin our conversation.
So I'm Talon Pascal. Right now we are on the unceded territory of the Lil'wat Nation, which is also part of the larger Statlium Nation. The Lil'wat Nation is one of the biggest nations in BC, and it goes all the way from Whistler, all the way up towards Mount Meagher, up the Pemberton Valley, and then down Lil'wat Lake towards Port Douglas there.
Can you talk about the significance of bow making and archery within the Lil'wat community, either now or historically?
Well, historically, the bow and arrow was something that was always very important, not only to Lil'wat people, but to people all over the North American, South American continent. For us and obviously other people, it was our lifeline. It was bow making and arrow making and flint knapping was just a necessity for. Traditionally, it was men and boys who did all the bow making and hunting, so it was just a necessity for them. Fathers would teach their sons at a young age how to make their own bows, how to make their own arrows. Young kids, anywhere from the ages of 6 to 10, would be practicing on little birds, hunting on little birds, and then as they got older, they would start shooting at dragonflies and grass stems. It's just bow making itself it's not only a sacred thing, it's just part of what people had to do back in the day. Like I said before, it was just a necessity. If you didn't know how to make a bow, then you couldn't hunt. If you knew how to make a bow but not a good bow, you still wouldn't be able to hunt properly. And one of the things I was always told was a good hunter would have lots of wives, and a bad hunter wouldn't have any wives at all. So basically it was the better bow you made, the more wives you would have. The sinew-back bow is arguably one of the most high-performing and effective bows that were made by native peoples. It wasn't only made here in British Columbia, it was made across North America. You get down in the prairies, they had the short buffalo sinew-back bows, and then you go all the way down to California, they had sinew-back bows. And the reason why wherever they could sinew-back bows, they would sinew-back bows, was because it was just how effective it was. And one of the things with the sinew-back bow is, with the self bow, something you might notice is the bow is bent in the same direction that it's going to be shot. So I'd be shooting it this way, but it's bent towards me, which is usually what you don't want. Bow makers call that set. So set is just when the bow is bent the same direction as when it's going to be shot. And with the sinew-backed bow, what we do is we actually string the bow backwards while we apply the sinew on, so that when the sinew dries, it either keeps that backwards bend or it stays completely straight. And the reason why that makes the bow so much more effective is when you string a bow and you shoot it, the bow is going to want to go back to this relaxed position, the straight position, or the backward bent position. So as you're drawing the bow back and shooting it, the bows obviously want to go back to that position, but the string's there to stop it. So it's offering more energy and more power to the arrow. The thing with a lot of indigenous archery is a lot of their bows are super short, so they weren't drawing their bows back super far like what I was saying, this was the draw point marker. We weren't drawing right to the end of the arrow.
Mm-hmm.
My personal draw is anywhere from 22 inches to 24 inches, which is pretty short. Like you get the English longbow hunters or the compound bow hunters that are pulling 30 inches long. So they always, with the longer draw, the thing with the longer draw is you actually get more speed because you're getting more of a power stroke. But with the shorter draw, you don't have as much speed. You still can get really fast arrow speeds, but just not as fast. So the way we compensated for that was we made lighter arrows so that just to get more arrow speed. That's why with a lot of the historical arrows that you find in the archaeological record here in North America, they're super small. Like these two arrowheads here are more closer to what the size you would find in the archaeological record, and just like you can fit them on the tip of your finger.
Can you talk about the materials used to make them, the bow and the arrows?
So traditionally here in Lil'wat, where the climate's a lot more damp, it's more of a coastal climate than when you go up to, say, Lil'wat, where it gets a lot drier. Here we used a lot more of the Pacific yew wood. We also used a lot of dogwood and Rocky Mountain maple and vine maple, which are all three of those are really common here. So yeah, this is a piece of yew wood. It's a yew wood self bow. Now, a self bow is a bow that's just made out of wood. There's nothing added to it. It's just a single piece of wood. Unlike a bow like this, which has a sinew, deer sinew glued to the back of it. This would be called a composite bow. And a composite bow is a bow that's made out of a composite of material, so it's made out of more than one material. So these two bows here, or these two type of bows, are really common around here. The self bow is a little bit more common, especially here in the Lil'wat territory, since it's a lot more damp. The thing with sinew is it's basically water activated, moisture activated, so if it was to get wet in the rain, then it'll delaminate, it'll start peeling off the back of the bow. So with most of my sinew bows that I make, I usually finish them off with a coating of modern wood finish, just so that I don't have to be scared of getting them wet or anything. A lot of my bows will have just the modern nylon string because you can get a lot better or more higher performance from them because they're so much lighter and they have less stress, or stretch I mean. With this bow I actually made a deer sinew string, which is what we would traditionally use, which is this stuff. This is what it would have looked like before when I dried it. And then I would pound it with another smooth rock to tease all the fibers out, and I'm basically just peeling these separate fibers out.
Right. A little similar to jerky.
Yeah. And the sinew is, well, the sinew is like the Achilles tendon. The Achilles tendon is sinew. So usually with the deer, we're getting the sinew from the leg or from the back, which is where these came from. It's the back sinew is the longest sinew, which is usually what you use to make string because it's really long. And I twisted it up and I soaked it in water because I twisted it up dry like this. And then after I twisted it up, I soaked it in water so that it would shrink and then it wouldn't fall apart. And they make fine strings, they work, they just don't work as good as this stuff because these stretch a lot. Most of my arrows would be made out of serviceberry, or most people around here probably know it as Saskatoon berry. In our language we call it chocolate. Other traditional woods that we use for our arrows would be birch or cedar. Those would be called split timber arrows because basically what we're doing is we're taking the trunk of a tree and we're cutting it down and then we're splitting sections out of it, and we're taking these little splinters and then we're carving them and rounding them out to make these arrows. This is a cedar arrow.
Light.
Yeah.
Really light.
Yeah. What I do is after I cut the shoots is I scrape all the bark off and then I'll leave them in a nice cool area where there's not in direct sunlight to let them completely dry. So that's usually anywhere from a month to 2 months. After they're dry, what we usually do is we build a fire and we heat the area that we want to straighten over the fire.
Traditional way of kind of bending it.
Yeah, and then we would straighten it out.
Very cool.
Another thing that Lil'wat hunters would traditionally do is, I don't really do them with my arrows because I haven't found the need to do them, but what they would often do is they would actually chew the arrows or the outside of the arrow shaft so that it breaks the grain of the wood so that it doesn't warp as easy. Something we see a lot in a lot of the West Coast arrows is the thing with hunting on the ground versus hunting on horseback. Like if you go down to the prairies, like the Lakota people, what you might find is a lot of their bows and arrows are really short because they're hunting off a horseback. So obviously when they're galloping on a horse toward a buffalo, you're getting real up and close and personal. So
Right.
you're not having to be as accurate. The rule of thumb is the longer your arrow is, the more easily accurate you can be. So a lot of the coastal people has had a lot longer arrows than that of the prairies.
Throughout this conversation, you've shared comments about what traditional Lil'wat hunters would be doing and crafting. Where did you gain some of this information? Is there a community you speak to, or is there an elder that you're working with one-on-one?
Most of the information that I got for my bows and arrows came from an old ethnographical account that a late 18th, early 19th century ethnographer had written and documented. His name was James Tate, and he had went all over Statliam territory documenting
Wow.
everything about, basically everyday life of the Statliam people, and it was everything from basket making to household items to
The entire Statliam area?
Yeah.
All the way up?
Yeah.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, so anywhere from basket making to pit house building, canoe making, clothing, jewelry, tattoos, and bow making and arrow making.
And how would you hope, this information, this historical information that you've discovered and then, made into a physical form again, gets passed on or moved forward? What would your hope be?
Well, my hope is that more people would take an interest to this stuff. Unfortunately, there's very little people in Lil'wat that know how to do this stuff or who want to do this stuff. In the whole of the Statliam Nation, there's still very little. I know very little people, and I definitely think that more indigenous people need to take an interest or step up to do this kind of stuff. And obviously the reason why I'm doing this now is to pass it on. Before, like I was saying, I was just curious on
Right.
wanting to do this. So before I wasn't planning to
Right.
teach or anything like that, but now, since I've know how to do this stuff, and I wouldn't say I mastered it, but I have gotten really good at it to where I can teach people.
Right.
Because even now I'm still learning things and getting better at things.
Well, thank you very much for the time and talking about the archery today, Talon.
Yeah.
We really, really appreciate it.
Flint knapping is the ancient art or technique of making tools out of stone. It's one of the oldest tool making types, I guess. Without it, humans would have never been able to survive. It's one of the oldest art forms, I would argue.
Very cool. How did you get started in it?
I got started in it around the same time I started the bow making, so around 8.5 years ago, and just out of curiosity. And then after I started it, I just kind of got hooked on it and just never stopped.
What was the significance of these tools? Do you mind showing us an example? What were the significance of these tools, and how did they impact Lil'wat community way of life or Statliam way of life?
Yeah, so flint knapping, just like the bow making, was very important. If a man didn't know how to flint knap, he wouldn't have been able to make his own tools. He wouldn't have been able to do any of the butchering or tool making, because the thing with flint knapping is, before you can make a bow, you have to know how to flint knap, because if you can't flint knap, then you can't make the tools to make the bow. So basically, the whole process of making your own hunting kit starts off with the flint knapping. So you got to make your own tools, and then you're gonna go out in the bush to cut a tree down to make your bow, and then you're gonna flint knap another tool to plane all that wood down. So everything starts off with the flint knapping. So traditionally in Lil'wat and Statlium territory, we would traditionally use what was called basalt. It's just this jet black stone. It's volcanic. It's not obsidian, but it is volcanic. And I get my basalt from a ancient quarry that most people know as the Arrowstone Hills, which is up towards Cache Creek and Kamloops there. And that was an ancient quarry that mostly the Shuswap people went to, but people here in Lil'wat would often receive this kind of stone through trade. Our traditional quarry was most likely up towards Mount Meager, which is the massive volcano up there, which is obviously where you would most likely get volcanic materials. Other materials would be agate or jasper, but those materials would have most likely been received through trade. We would also have obsidian, but we didn't have any obsidian around here. Like the other stuff, we would receive that through trade with the Squamish people. Like they would get their obsidian from Mount Garibaldi. Other obsidian would have came from up north, like in Anaheim Lake area where the Chilcotin people lived. Most of the obsidian though would have just again been received through trade. We wouldn't have actually physically went to the areas because like I said, with Anaheim Lake area, that was Chilcotin territory, and Chilcotins were our traditional enemies, so there was really no way that we would have physically went over there to gather the material ourselves. Another cool thing with the obsidian is, I'm not really sure how it works, but they're able to analyze something with the obsidian where they're able to tell what the source of the obsidian was, so where it came from. So with our recent archaeological dig that we had this summer, we did find some obsidian chips and flakes. We didn't find any full-on obsidian artifacts like these arrowheads or spear points, but we did find little bits of it. So the plan is to analyze those to see where they came from, and then from that we can really see the extent of the trade. Yeah.
I can help with that, being a science teacher. Being a past science teacher, every stone, wherever it was formed, it shares a similar composition atom-wise to all the other rock that it's with. So if we can find the location that the rock was made in, or if we have an idea, and then we can kind of look at the rock and see its composition on an atomic level, then they'll actually match. So every stone from a different quarry, quote unquote, could be able to be matched with a reasonable amount of, security that it is there, just based on kind of the composition on the atomic level. Yeah. But as the rock gets older, or where it gets harder and harder. It's a pretty cool way for archaeologists to kind of track who was trading with who and why, and then we can kind of start figuring out what was exactly traded, because it wasn't just arrowhead for arrowhead. There was probably other materials and other things that were moved around.
So usually you'll start off with what's called a nodule. So with this basalt stuff, when we're out in the quarry, we're actually looking in the creek beds for these little nodules or cobbles. So oftentimes they're going to start off pretty round, and what we have to do is we actually have to split those cobbles open. And if you're going to be making these larger implements like these knife blades or spear points, what we're going to do is we're going to try to find an elongated cobble, and then we're going to split that so we get two pieces. And then those two pieces are already semi-flat and already in the basic shape. And then from there we're going to be using what's called percussion. So we're going to be taking a large piece of antler or stone cobble. These are the tools we would use for percussion. Usually we would use heavy deer antler or moose antler, preferably moose antler because you can get them a lot bigger and a lot heavier. This one's made out of a mule deer antler. More modern knappers will use these copper boppers.
Oh, cool.
I like to use that a lot. The metal copper tools do make flint knapping a lot easier, I think. Less chance of breakage, I personally think, but I still do use these antler tools just for the nostalgia. So basically what you're going to do is you would have a pad of leather or maybe a piece of bark, and then you would have your split nodule or cobble, and you're basically going to be taking these bigger flakes off of it, and what that's doing is you're trying to thin that piece down so that it's more easier to shape. And after you do that, you're going to be using what's called pressure flaking, and from there you're going to be using these antler tines, and you'll have a pad of leather on your hand, and then you'll have your work piece, and you're basically just going to be, instead of hitting flakes off, you're pressing flakes off. So you're using pressure, which is why it's called pressure flaking.
You said, you know, the flint knapping and the bow making started with curiosity, but now that you're 8 years down the road doing this stuff, how do you feel about, you know, when you're building these things and then seeing it go from a piece of stone all the way to an arrow that you're using to shoot? Does it impact you in a certain way?
I mean, obviously it feels really cool to do something that was being done in the past and to do it successfully, and to know that these can take animals, and to at least I've been trying to take an animal with it. I haven't done it yet, but I'll keep trying. I'll do it one day.
Yeah.
And let me tell you, when I do take an animal with my own gear, it's going to be a special feeling. I can already tell, because
I bet
no one has ever done this with their own handmade bows and arrows, like handmade Lil'wat style bows and arrows, arrowheads and arrows. So when I do it, I'll probably be the first person to do it within a couple 100 years.
Yeah.
I think it's an art form.
I would agree.
It's the same thing with the basket making. You have basket makers all over Mount Currie now, so I think it's important to keep the basket making alive. So I think it's also important to keep the traditional bow making alive, because this was practically gone when I started.
Yep.
Unfortunately, we don't have any surviving original examples of, you know, traditional bows. So I had to start from scratch. It was just from words in a book that I had to take and apply what I read to what I already knew. So I had to use the basic bow making and what I read, and had to put all that together. I think it's good just to keep it going, because once it's gone, and no one else is wanting to pick it up, it'll just disappear. It'll be gone. So I think it's really important to keep it going. I also think it's really important, especially for today, a lot of archaeologists are finding these things but not knowing how it actually works. I mean, they might know how some of it works, but something I found is you have archaeologists who know a lot of things, and then you'll have, you know, the most random person living on Vancouver Island who is an expert flint knapper and who knows more than the archaeologist. So I think it's really good to have both, right? So which is why I'm doing the archaeology and the flint knapping, so that I'm able to understand both worlds.
Well, I'm glad there's someone here on Lil'wat territory revitalizing and bringing it back, and I don't think you'll be the last one.
Yeah, I really hope not.
Thanks again for chatting with us, Talon. What was the significance of these boats for the Lil'wat people?
So the canoe was one of the main forms of transport, because if it wasn't taking a trail, it was always just a canoe, because we didn't have any horses before colonization. So the canoe was the fastest way to get around, and that's really evident with a lot of the rock paintings we actually find in our territory, because a lot of the rock paintings are actually I guess maps almost. They're kind of like a lot of the rock paintings are forms of maps that they draw down, and so that really shows you how important rivers were. They brought you everywhere you needed to go, and the canoe is what you rode. In the past, before colonization, dugout canoes weren't as common as they were after colonization. Part of the reason why was because before colonization, we didn't have any metal tools. It was all just
Right.
with stone tools. So we did use dugout canoes. They just weren't as common because they were a lot more
Labor
harder to make,
intensive, yeah, of course.
because we're using stone tools, and a lot of times we would actually burn the inside of the canoe out. After colonization, we had access to metal tools. Dugout canoes became a lot more common. Before colonization, and the times when dugout canoes weren't as common, James Tate states that there was a type of spruce bark canoe that we used. So we did use bark canoes because they were just so much easier to make. They were
Right.
easy to carry around. But after that, dugout canoes became more common.
We know that you've got a ton of experience building bows and flint knapping. How did you get into learning this craft?
So this was our very first canoe that me and a buddy of mine made. It was, we had never made a canoe prior to this, so it was all just reading off of the James Tate ethnography and asking other people. We also consulted with a Nulchanuth canoe maker on Vancouver Island who's out there making the massive ocean-going canoes with the massive old growth cedars, which unfortunately we don't have access to. So it took us a really long time just to find a big enough cedar that was, good enough for a canoe. After we had finished the canoe, we had actually made this canoe by a little swampy lake in our territory. Most people know it as Eddie's Lake. The reason why we made it there was because it's all cedar trees over there, and that was the only place we could find a suitable cedar tree. So traditionally what would happen was a lot of times most canoe makers would make the canoe where they felled the tree. So that's what we did over there. We made most of the canoe there, we did most of the work there, and then we brought it over here to finish it up. But we knew that once we finished the canoe, we wanted to launch it in Eddie's Lake because that was where the canoe was made. That's where it was born. So we launched it there, but before we did, we smudged the canoe just to cleanse the canoe. It's our first canoe. We never done it before, so yeah, we were just really proud of doing it. So traditionally, Lil'wat people used cedar, which was the most common coniferous tree around here, but we also used cottonwood. And when a lot of people think of cottonwood, they always think of this useless wood that's always rotten and making a lot of trouble for all the power lines. But we used it because of how soft the wood was. It's the same thing with cedar; it's soft wood. The only downside to using cottonwood was it didn't last so long. We have traditional canoes that are still out in the land around here that were made out of cedar that are still around. One of the older canoes down Lil'wat Lake there was around 200 years, give or take, 200 years old, and it was made out of cedar, and it's still there. You can still see the basic shape. We also used Sitka spruce and Douglas fir whenever we had to, whenever cedar or cottonwood wasn't available, but cottonwood and cedar are pretty widespread around here. Obviously we're taking a round log and then transforming it into a canoe, so there's a lot of squaring off, there's a lot of rounding off, and there's a lot of finding the center line, because one of the first things we had to do was we actually had to split the top of the log off to establish the top of the canoe, and then once we did that, we had to find the very center of the log and draw a line down there. So all that, taking that top off, taking the bottom off, was all done with an axe. Shaping both ends was all done with an axe. For the inside, what we did was we used what's called an adze, and it's basically like it kind of looks like a garden hoe, but it's got a kind of a curved blade that you use, basically kind of like a pickaxe. So you're basically chopping the wood away. And that's basically all we used for hollowing it out. the majority of the wood. And then for the tedious wood removal for the gunnels, to make sure that we get them the right thickness and make sure we're not going too deep, we use what's called scorp, or a curved draw knife. And that really just helps you get in there and get those nice thinning shavings, and then you get down in there and make sure that you get the nice curve of the gunnel. There was a lot of log rolling involved during the first part of the process because we were peeling the bark off. We had to peel all that bark off first, and then we had to take all the sapwood off, because something you might notice is there's no sapwood on this.
Yeah.
It's all heartwood.
Right.
Because the sapwood is what rots first. There are a couple other canoe makers in the Lil'wat Nation. I think we're just the youngest.
Yeah.
And again, a lot of the information for this canoe came from the James Tate book, but the basic design and measurements came from one of the canoes that is housed in the Squamish Lil'wat Culture Center that was made by one of the elders who used to live around here. They're gone now. His name was Charlie Mack. And we got all the measurements from there, and it was really good to have something to look at, like something physical to look at and to take measurements off of, which made it so much easier.
And do you have future plans for this?
Yeah, so we're going to be taking this canoe up the Pimmerton Valley, and then hopefully paddling it down the Lil'wat River all the way down to Lil'wat Lake, just to kind of, it's kind of just to recreate one of our old stories, the Copper Canoe story that was written in the Charlie Mack book. The story is a lot longer than it is, but just to keep it short, it's a story about how the Transformers had taken a canoe and basically carved out the area where the river is now. They're the ones who basically carved out all the river systems.
Well, thank you so much, Talon, for sharing the canoe and sharing the story of this, and good luck on the journey.
Yeah, thank you.
If you'd like to continue learning, you can follow along on our YouTube channel or wherever you listen to podcasts. And you can find additional resources on our website at downywenjack.ca. Thanks and take care.